please do not run out, because I'll just give you a little bit of instruction after this talk about what to expect next with our worship service. But now, again, for our last speaker of today, Mrs. Ann Kennedy. She is a favorite here at St. Luke's. This is not her first time speaking here, and we most recently had her, I think, for last year's Lenten series. Ann lives in, so completely different perspective here, just as people live in the world as inhabited beings. Reverend Dr. Greg Peters lives in California, right in the kind of middle of that milieu of what's going on the West Coast. And Ann is in New York, in upstate New York, where she mothers her young children and helps her husband keep body and soul together in the pastoring of a small Anglican church. Those of you who went and saw the Stand Firm podcast, her husband, Matt, was the one that JD frequently was making fun of. Cracking jokes at. I framed that wrong, forgive me. Ann grew up in French-speaking West Africa and wrote the book Nailed It, 365 Readings for Angry and Worn-Out People. I first became aware of Ann after hearing her speak about this book on a podcast. This was the first year it came out, because we still have the old cover of it. But as soon as I heard her talk about it, I'm like, oh, my wife will love this, because it is so down to earth, dealing with life as it's really lived. And she and Jen enjoyed it. And like with two other books I mentioned here, if you want to add something to your devotional life, your home needs to have this, and I'm sure she would agree. Ann is, as many of you are, a former Episcopalian, and she profoundly understands the history and tension within the Anglican communion over the last few decades. Known for her wit and wry sense of humor, she blogs at Preventing Grace, Substacks at Demotivations with Ann, and podcasts at Preventing Grace. Please welcome Mrs. Ann Kennedy.
I'll just lower this out there. Is that okay? Can you sort of hear me? I have to adjust myself. Okay, closer, but I've got to open my... Okay. Right. I have to be able to turn my pages and see my text. All right, I'll get there. Just hang on. Well, thank you so much for having me. Every time JD strong arms me into coming here, I say, this is the last time. So we'll see. My talk today, which I had a hard time coming up with a title, which is why your nice, beautiful booklets doesn't tell you at all what I'm going to be talking about. My title is Very Members in Corporate, 7 Ways to Make Life More Congenial. So if you follow me online at all, which I know many of you do, you'll know that last week my refrigerator died. This was a huge blessing for me, because all of the plastic drawers in my fridge had already broken and are duct taped together back again. And because when we first bought this fridge, I was a fool and a knave, and I did not consider how the door of my kitchen ensuite bathroom, because who doesn't want a tiny loo in the middle of their food preparation area? Our house is 100 plus years old. It has character. How the door of the bathroom would prevent the door of the fridge from ever being fully open. So you can open the door of the fridge to get food, but you cannot open it wide enough to clean anything inside of the fridge. None of the plastic drawers could ever be fully extricated, which is a tragedy, because I have, as you said, 6 children. They're actually not that young anymore, and yet they still don't know how to right a container of yogurt that has fallen over and oozed forth its contents all over the back. So every so often over the last 10 years, I have broken my back and my arms working various long implements around trying to de-encrust the junk off of my once gleaming refrigerator. And this, it occurs to me, is a pretty good, though disgusting, metaphor of how technology in particular creates unreasonable expectations that sets us at odds with ourselves, and which reverberates as a sort of spiritual malaise in our backward and already disordered world. So I have expressed many of these ideas online, and some of my faithful readers last week got into a tiff, because one of my favorite pastimes is to complain about technology. The instigator of this particular controversy did have a point. The problem that we humans have is not our gadgets. It is that we hate God. Get rid of the idolatry, insisted Reepicheep, for that is his pseudonym, and if he's here, hello. I have no idea where you live in the world. Get rid of the idolatry and everything will be peachy. And that would be so great. But one of the interesting things about technology is that it enables certain forms of idolatry, that if we could properly observe them and their subversive properties, we might more easily relinquish them, I think, at least as Christians, or at least consider what they are. It might be possible for people, even women, to live happier, more integrated lives than they are doing now. The title of this time we have together, as you've all been told multiple times now, is Ourselves, Our Souls, Our Bodies, which comes from that wonderful line in the Eucharistic prayer, the point at which we try to apprehend how God could join our frail mortal bodies together into his glorified and eternal one. Because there is one bread, says Paul, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. We are atomized, alienated as we come forward one by one to receive the gift of his precious body and blood. And as we come, he binds us together in a spiritual unity that no one of us could possibly articulate in words, and yet functions as the substrata of our life together. Like most women, the body part of the equation that is most uncomfortable for me is not that of Jesus. He's good to go. It's my own. And not because of its materiality so much, although that's a real pain, but because of the spiritual world it is forced to inhabit. The technological nature of life sets certain expectations before me that makes the relationship between the world of my mind and the world of my body angular and frustrating. You may have noticed, we women have been around the spiritual block, so to speak, over the last century. 4 different waves of feminism have tried to remediate the feminine condition, but have only managed to gradually destroy the family and the work that undergirded the family. We've traversed through wondering if women are even human, to the badlands of wondering if men are. We have tried every sort of morality, every sort of social structure, every manner of dress, every kitchen gadget, and 1,000 kinds of parenting techniques. And what are we left with 150 years on? A broken fridge that promised to make me really productive in the kitchen and failed utterly. So today I want to very briefly outline where we are, and then offer one of my favorite literary and theological devices, the listicle. It's Friday, so that means Friday takes. 7 ways to make the experience of being a man or a woman in these long purgatorial days before the return of our Lord a little bit more congenial. So, part one, where are we going and why are we in this handbasket? The handbasket, we're going to hell. That's what the expression is. Just, I'll give away the game. You remember that strange woman in Zechariah. I'll read the text. Then the angel who talked with me, came forward and said to me, "Lift up your eyes and see what this is that is going out." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "This is the basket that is going out." And he said, "This is their iniquity in all the land." And behold, the leaden cover was lifted, and there was a woman sitting in the basket. And he said, "This is wickedness." And he thrust her back into the basket and thrust down the leaden weight on its opening. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, two women coming forward, and the wind was in their wings. They had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the basket between heaven and earth. Then I said to the angel who talked with me, "Where are they taking the basket?" And he said to me, "To the land of Shinar, to build a house for it. And when this is prepared, they will set the basket down there on its base. Unless the Lord builds the house." Am I right? No? Okay. As I'm reading this out, I hope you all can see the sort of caught between heaven and earth bit that's so wonderful. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about. In the era of COVID, I read a few books that have gently reordered my assumptions about our postmodern world and how it has been assembled. One of them that I talk about all the time, which JD has already mentioned, is called Feminism Against Progress by Mary Harrington. Harrington locates the first transhumanist cyborg adventure to be the widespread adoption of the pill. In a recent article, she summarizes her own work, and this article is so wonderful. I hope JD will make it available to you somehow. She writes, "For the first time with the pill, a medical technology was adopted not to restore normal physiological functions, specifically female fertility, in the name of health, but to interrupt normal functions in the name of individual freedom. This inaugurated a radical transformation in our understanding of what a person is, in which embodied attributes, once understood as irreducible givens, beginning with sex difference, have come to be seen as optional and the subject to individual choice and re-engineering. Importantly, in as much as women have embraced this technologically enabled understanding of ourselves, in which female fertility is viewed as an option whose default setting is off, we have embraced our own fusion with technology as a precondition for participation in public life. Much of the mainstream social fabric in Western societies is downstream of such technologies. In other words, the default modern Western culture is already a cyborg one," unquote. Many students of history have noticed with chagrin, or Anglican students of history, that in the 1930s, the Lambeth meeting convened by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, someone named Cosmo Gordon Lang, I grokked it because I couldn't remember who it was, voted to allow the use of contraception in certain very limited situations. But of course, it eventually came to include everyone all the time, a stratagem the Roman Catholics managed to avoid even in the aftermath of Vatican II. But the use of the pill, even with Roman Catholic resistance, swept across the West and now around the world, and reordered the sexual and relational lives of men and women, and in consequence, their spiritual ones as well. In many ways, as Harrington and others observe, the pill allowed sex to be governed by market forces. The body, once a spiritually infused subject in relationship to other subjects, is now a malleable object, one whose identity or essence can be altered by the use of surgery, or the greatest source of authenticity, TikTok, which is the logical consequence of the smartphone. Quoting Harrington again, Smartphones proved to be the digital equivalent to the pill. Every bit as intimate, as seemingly indispensable, and as deeply implicated in everyday freedoms and commerce. And as with the pill, the global transformation that has followed their normalization has reshaped politics, culture, sex, family, and even consciousness itself. Most centrally, it has reshaped what we mean when we say identity. For possessing an always-on, networked, handheld device enables every user to turn away from the arbitrary, immediate, real-world features of our lives as the principal forces shaping who we are. Instead, it has grown increasingly possible to curate social groups based on interests and affinities, infinitely adjustable virtual avatars, and even erotic and romantic entanglements conducted partly or wholly in dematerialized or a digital realm, unquote. Really, you've got to read the whole article. What this amounts to for conservative women especially is a certain kind of self-justification through social media. The competing poles of feminine identity, the sort of winged stork women dragging the woman in the basket to Shinar as fast as they ever can, these admit no neutrality. The economics of sexuality results in dehumanizing porn, babies bought and paid for by men pretending to be women, and a scary demographic collapse. Untethered from socially cohesive communion, women today preach to each other through stories and reels on Insta, Facebook, and X. One of my favorites is a Russian lady who married an oligarch of some kind and bought a McMansion somewhere here in the South. Her gospel is wealth. She films herself putting on makeup and arranging her extensive collection of designer clothes. Along the bottom of the screen always scrolls some affirming message like, "Our life becomes beautiful not because we are perfect. Beauty in life appears when you put awareness into everything you come in contact with." Boy, is that hell. Why do I always click? I always click. I want to know what will happen next. Where will she put her large fake tree? What kind of berries will she feed her pug dog? I don't want to look at the chaos of my own refrigerator. I want to look at her happy and serene McMansion. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more people making TikToks today filled with spiritual messages about the self than there are people going to church. And I bet most of them are women, and many of them, a huge number, I don't know how to think in maths, a huge number produce so-called trad content. Trad content for me illumines the great chasm that is fixed between two kinds of women today. The women who want to do the anti-body feminism of the last century even harder, who, even in supposed Christian circles, saw on about ethical non-monogamy and ethically sourced porn. I can't remember the person who does this, but she's supposedly Lutheran, and she's a really strange person. I'm sure you can remember her name. Nadia Bolz-Weber, there we are. That's one kind of woman. On the other side are the women who are sick to death of wage slave labor, who have had to give their babies over to institutional childcare, or who have never had children at all because no man will commit to marriage, and who long for a world they have never inhabited. The ordinary world where the body, mind, and soul are not fixed by technologies as though they are broken. Ironically, much of the technology, insofar as it cleaves the soul and mind from the body and puts it on the screen or into the app, ends up being actually a full measure of wickedness that millions of exploited men and women and even children bear, the heavy economic weight upon the lid of the basket, admitting no light, no sanity, and certainly no order. The makers and apologists of these devices are carrying away the souls of women to Babel, that great and terrible tower that teeters in the sky. But because we are very members incorporate in the mystical body of the Lord Jesus, there is no reason not to take proactive steps to pry open the refrigerator, tear out its broken constructs, and return to something life-giving. We can have nice things, I think, if we are willing to prefer the true body over all the fake ones. So here's my listicle. It's called the listicle. Part 2, the listicle. 1, ditch egalitarianism. In fact, go ahead and admit that there is no such thing. Sociologists and social engineers often notice that women prefer a quote, even playing field. When little girls are arranging their games, they will spend hours jostling amongst themselves, trying to prevent any single one of them from gaining primacy. And yet, if you know any little girls, or the women they grow up into, you will know they are keenly aware of the social hierarchies that they constantly reinforce through equality. Men in this are more straightforward. A fight and everyone knows where they are. Women have a harder time being that clear. And this is why you should never believe anyone who says they want or believe in equality. What they want, though they will not admit it even to themselves, is to dictate to other people how they ought to live their lives while pretending they're not doing that. I don't want to betray my sex, even though I just totally did it. But every time a woman tells me she is equal to her husband, I mutter to myself, "Sure thing, sugar." Which is what the young lady says to me at my gym when I ask her if I can stand in the red light machine. What the woman vaunting her equality is really saying is that she is the governing member of the household, either her own private one or the household of faith. The man in this case is not free to do much of consequence that she may disagree with. And if that's how you want to do it, fine, but why not tell the truth? Why not admit, like Jory Micah, that poor young person who flamed out so spectacularly, that you are actually the head of the household? Didn't work for her. The thing is, the man, even when he doesn't want to be, is the head of the house ontologically, just as Christ is head over the church. He may be really bad at it. He may be dysfunctional and weak. He may be tyrannical, but nothing he nor the members of his family can say will ever undo this fact. If you don't want to believe me or the Bible, just go read Edwin Friedman, who brilliantly elucidates this obvious fact by means of family system theory. Go read Generation to Generation. Wonderfully, though, for the man who is properly the head of his house, just as Christ is the head of the church, the kind of life that is displayed to the outside will be precisely the generous one everyone longs for. It will appear to be a place of easy geniality, of shared work, of liberty of thought, and of pleasure and joy. And that is because role and function, as important as they are second to the mysterious incorporation of the members together with each other. This is one of those awful tricks where to get the thing you want, you have to give up your rights to have it at all. What was it that Jesus said on this subject? I cannot remember, and I'm not going to look it up. 2, take number 2, live action role play vernacular gender. Along with deconstructing the myth of equality, it is well past time to recover what Ivan Illich calls vernacular gender. In many ways, this is the most essential and also the most impossible task of our age. For those of you unfamiliar with the idea of vernacular gender, which ironically, according to Illich, does not exist anymore, having been replaced with what he calls economic sex, essentially the concept is that before industrialization, and still in some remote parts of the world, there existed a sort of ambiguous complementarity. It wasn't that we were all human in two sexes, male and female, which is how we like to talk about ourselves now as both so preciously made in the image of God, which is true, but fine. Rather, gender for Illich, quote, implies a complementarity within the world that is fundamental and closes the world in on us, however ambiguous and fragile this closure might be. Gender, he writes, is vernacular. It is both tough and adaptable, as precarious and vulnerable as vernacular speech. As happens with the latter, vernacular speech, gender is obliterated by education, and its existence is soon forgotten or even denied. As you can see, gender in this sense isn't a social construct the way people use the word today, but a soul incarnated in a particular cultural expression. The book is full of wonderful examples, his book called Gender, but I'll use one from my own life. Where I grew up in West Africa, to be a woman, I think there's a movie called that, What is a Woman? Is that a movie? To be a woman meant to go and collect wood in the bush for the fire, carry it home on your head, and heat the bath for your husband. If you asked someone in the long days of the past before the village moved to the road, what is a woman? They would say that a woman is the person who gathers the wood and heats the bath. But along came a man who took his donkey and a cart out into the bush and collected the wood for his wife and brought it back to the village. Was this right of him? As Westerners, we would all say, yes. But that is hubris, for we know nothing of the fragile ecosystem that produced that outward invisible sign of inward femininity. Now, of course, it is all gone. A woman in West Africa is a person who goes to school and gets a government job. This sort of world where function, meaning, work, and kinship are tightly bound together would take an anthropologist 20 years to untangle is unimaginable to us now. Our conceptions of sex are so deep, they might take 3 whole blog posts to describe. Nevertheless, though we cannot understand or imagine it, I think we should try. At the center of this imagining is work. Quoting Illich again, what housework is now, women of old did not do. However, the modern woman finds it hard to believe that her ancestor did not have to work in another economy. That's what was happening. Irrefutably, the new histories of housework describe the typical activity of the housewife as something unlike anything women have done outside industrial society, as something that cannot be suitably accounted for as just one more facet of the unreported economy, and as something the dogmatic categories of social reproduction simply cannot meaningfully signify. That's a mouthful, but to elucidate his point, he describes what it would have been like to cook an egg for breakfast in the world of vernacular gender, as opposed to the one of economic sex. Back in the day, your great-grandmother hobbled out to her cow, like Hannah Nealman, only from Ballerina Farm, only without a lot of cameras to witness her doing it. Your great-grandmother milked the cow, churned the butter, gathered some wood, took an egg from the coop, and cooked the egg. Now, of course, you have to put gas in your car that probably came from Canada. Is that where we get gas? Not sure. You have to drive your car that was made somewhere else. You have to go to a large supermarket where all the eggs cost $18,000. You have to drive home, forget that you have no butter, and drive back to the store. Illich again. Unlike the production of goods and services, which is what he's describing there is called shadow work. Shadow work is performed by the consumer of commodities, specifically the consuming household. He calls shadow work any labor by which the consumer transforms a purchased commodity into a usable good. This kind of hidden economic system has rendered present-day housework, Illich was writing in the early 80s, he says, more lonely, more dull, more impersonal, and more time-polluting. He describes it as a new muffled stress, and boy was he right. It is a world apart from the vernacular one where things were homemade, homespun, homegrown, and not destined for the marketplace. Gender, he writes, is something other and much more than sex. It bespeaks a social polarity that is fundamental and in no two places the same. And this, it seems to me, is precisely the place where the local church comes into view. We cannot escape the grind of economic sex, nor the tyranny of wage labor. But when we cross the threshold of God's realm, the church, there might be ways for local custom to develop in deep, meaningful ways, for the spiritually oriented roots of culture to take shape. First, so that no two churches look the same and are not interchangeable. And second, so that the work of men and women inside the body, materially and practically, takes on the homespun feel of a pre-technological age. It means having separate men's and women's spaces. It means letting some of the mysteries of humanity settle out without litigating them all the time. It means letting the altar guild ladies have their head and not messing with their domain, even if you're the priest. Man. It means men's retreats where you sing Johnny Simmons' Raise a Glass to the King and complain about the obtuseness and ridiculousness of your wives. That was take number 2. Take number 3, get an education. Following closely upon my point about vernacular gender, I cannot help but lament the condition of theological education of women in the body of Christ. This probably doesn't pertain to any of us here because we're all here learning together, but overall, evangelicalism in America is in shambles. One reason we don't even possess a vestigial memory of vernacular gender, I think, is because we don't read the Bible with any particular curiosity. It has been to the detriment of the church that women have largely been siloed into sex-specific Bible study groups that don't illumine and reveal the mysteries of the scriptures in a satisfying way. And no one, at least not anyone that I know, is not going to educate their daughters in this cyborg age. We don't have the luxury of deciding not to equip our girls to function in the age of AI. Do we want them all to get married and occupy themselves comfortably at home? That would be lovely. But they also will probably have to earn a living of some kind. And as they do, their education in the scriptures has got to be hefty enough to ground them in biological realities. Infantilizing the women didn't work. Infantilizing the men didn't work. Everybody has to learn. If there is any equality, it should be in catechesis, in going deep into the scriptures and finding God is sufficient for the needs of the whole person. In fact, I would locate the leftward drift of many churches and the women within them to biblical malnourishment. It's not the only reason, but it's one of them. Women's needs to be fed by the scriptures and the Eucharist were not taken seriously enough. And so, starving, they went online and they began going to conferences and they found other kinds of food, and many of them left the church altogether. If you in your church find a group of dissatisfied, fomenting women who are suddenly very interested in talking about role and position of women in the church, and you're the preacher, you might want to go back and listen to some of your own sermons. Are you phoning it in? Are you growing yourself spiritually? This isn't always the case, of course, but a woman's spiritual hunger is as great as a man, and she needs to be fed. Take number 4. Have a long and thoughtful conversation about status. A few weeks ago, I came across a pretty great article called "It's Embarrassing to be a Stay-at-Home Mom." The article was long and full of advice that doesn't pertain to what we are talking about today, but his point that status is a necessary function of human society, and that the mother, for the most part, unless she is a beautiful social media influencer who's also probably Mormon, has almost no status, that point cannot be dismissed. But really, it's not just mothering. Most women, no matter what they are doing today, feel like they need to justify themselves. Observe how, as women have become more and more, quote, liberated and free, they have simultaneously had to spend more and more time explaining themselves. And this has enormous implications for the church. There is only one kind of high-status work in the church, because of industrialism, basically, and that is the job of the priest, who, as we all know, is supposed to be the servant of all, and therefore never depends on the authority and deference afforded to the crisp white collar at the neck, the flapping stole, or the clerical ring. While the debate about what kind of people can or should be ordained is important and will hopefully find a happy conclusion, useful work in the kingdom of God must in some kind be available to women. The very polarizing political nature of debates over men and women, I hope, may soon soften, and women will be able to find work that gives them dignity, authority, and yes, even in some meaningful and feminine way, power. Would to God that we could recover the days of an iron-willed matriarch sitting bolt upright in the front pew, Bible open, and the preacher, knees quaking, having to adequately divide the word of truth in her presence. 5, make the church genteel again. Is that MAGA? No. Doesn't work. Following from that previous point, some of you here might remember a time in the recent past when men and women did not belittle each other quite so much. I think it was like that in the 80s. This, I think, is another function of the fake egalitarianism that has poisoned so many ecclesiastical spaces. It should not be that men talk down to women or women talk down and belittle men. Perhaps you here in the South are not troubled by this habit, but in many places, anger and fear creep into the discourse about sex and gender. As I said, I am always willing to blame technology whenever possible, and social media, I think, is a huge part of the problem. But speaking as a woman, whether online or in person, the way women are talked about, even sometimes by themselves, is not very friendly. I think reasonable solutions to many persistent problems might be found if a certain archaic gentility were to arise, like the South once again. 6, use the unrighteous mammon of technology to make friends along the way. We cannot escape the technology that now governs our lives. Unless you are very much more wise and clever than I am, I don't see how most of us will be able to function without a smartphone. Does anybody here have a dumb phone that works? Oh, yeah. I don't even know how to do that. You have a dumb phone. Yes. There might be some sense in which we can redeem the technologies that intrude on our lives and turn them to good, although I don't know how well this would work. Offering your devices to God as a hideous sacrifice, and occasionally entering into the realms that other people are comfortable with, but also immiserated by, like various social media spaces, is something I'm pretty sure St. Paul would approve of. I guess what I mean is if you're really good at making reels or using the socials, That's not necessarily wicked, especially if you can aid in the divine work of encouraging and strengthening the brokenhearted. But be cautious and beware as you do it. And finally, take number 7. In a world of Athaliahs, be a Sarah. You remember Athaliah. She would rule, though the fury of hell came against her. She killed all the king's sons, save one that she did not know about. She brought false gods into the land. Her brutality and entitlement was, well, biblical. She was hell in a handbasket. There are a lot of women like her today who insist on their rights, who already know everything, who won't sit under the word of God, who are determined to take us all to the land of Shinar. But before Athaliah, there was Sarah, that tough old nut. She lived almost her whole life without getting the one thing she most particularly desired. When she finally got it, she was old. So old, in fact, that the situation was ridiculous. And so she laughed. And in wonder, she asked, "Shall I also have pleasure?" I heard a preacher, bewildered by the question, think she was probably talking about, as we like to call it in our family, marital unpleasantness. But I think a lot of women know what she meant. She meant the astonishing and sacrificial pleasure of nursing a baby. For me, the only joy greater than that, and it's a great joy, is standing along with all the believers of my local church and casting up to God in that last prayer after communion that He must not forget to incorporate us together, body and soul, into His own body. Thank you.